Want to make sure you never miss a new release from the official Creepypasta.com YouTube channel again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Multiple Shadows and Other Phenomena by Joe 090306. My name is Joe. I'm a 33-year-old man living in Massachusetts in my own home. With me is my son, aged 8, my girlfriend, and her 3 children, aged 9, 7, and 4. The children are with us a little more than half the time, as we both share custody with our respective exes. They've only recently moved in the past few weeks, while my son has been with me since he was born. I also have 3 dogs, all of which are very well trained, but protective of the family and property should someone attempt to come around when we are not home. First, I've lived in this home for 9 years. Some of that time I was married, but the majority of it I've been single. For as long as I've lived here, I've seen multiple black shadows moving around my room at night. These shadows range from human-sized to massive blob-like shapes, covering an entire quarter of the ceiling, usually in a corner over my bed. They move in such an odd way, seemingly gliding and swirling, akin to a lava lamp. For the most part, they tend to move around my bed, either settling directly over me near the ceiling, or coalescing and standing at the side or foot of my bed. On a few occasions, I've had them come so close as to block out my vision completely, and I've had to back up to realise that it was literally face to face. I say that, but I have never seen a face or any detail. They are rarely in a human shape, even if they are the size of an average man. It looks more like a mist or funnel cloud than a human form. I've always felt uneasy, but never genuinely threatened. I'm not the only person to witness these shadows, and at the time I'm always awake, clear-headed, and typically blink several times and rub my eyes to ensure that I am seeing what I am seeing, and it's not just a trick of the eyes in a nearly pitch-black room. I do believe in the paranormal, but I would consider myself a healthy skeptic. My first instinct isn't, it's a ghost or it's a demon. That being said, recently in my home, these shadows have appeared more often than not, and I have had other things occur that I cannot readily explain. I have, within the last few months, heard what sounds like footsteps when I'm alone in the house, and the dogs are all sleeping or in my line of sight. The dogs do react to the footsteps, but rarely bark, more of a perked ear and an investigative look, rather than a show of force. I've been woken up to what sounds like conversation in my living room. Thinking I left the television on before I went to bed, I get up to turn it off, only to have it go completely silent when I get close to the room. And of course the TV is off. Lastly, this past week, a glass dish was drying on my drying rack among some other dishes. It had been washed close to 4 hours before, and had sat in room temperature for the rest of the time. I would say it broke, but that's not an accurate term. Exploded would be a better one for it. This happened at about 2:30 in the morning, and I was in the living room while my girlfriend was in the bedroom. The pop of the glass was enough to wake her on the opposite side of the house, and enough to scare the living crap out of me. No other dishes moved, no other dishes were affected, and there were shards of glass literally 15 feet away from the drying rack, which doesn't sit near a window nor a vent for temperature fluctuations. I am at a complete loss as to what caused it to shatter so violently. The RedEyed Shadow by Sinister Serpent. It all began when I was 10. My family and I moved from Indiana to be closer to my mother's family. We live roughly half a block away from them. When we first moved in, I had a bad feeling due to several things only I seemed to pick up on. It was a 1-story, 4-bedroom, 2-bath home. Any time I'd walk from my room to the kitchen, I'd get this feeling like my instincts were telling me to run, something's behind you. Also, I kept getting a nauseous feeling any time I was in the hall bathroom. my family and I began to hear noises. This was a fairly old home, built in the early to late 60s. We assumed it was an animal, so my father called an exterminator. The exterminator told us that there were no vermin in the house. There wasn't even a nook or cranny they could get in through. The noises continued. After that, things escalated. Things would disappear only to reappear in the hall bathroom, in the sink cabinet. Needless to say, my parents blamed us, and they seemed to change. They were always very loving, but now they'd fight over the smallest things. My little sister began hearing growling in her bedroom, and what sounded like pacing at night. I began hearing knocking on my window. Not a frenzied knock, more like a steady, let me in knock. I just assumed it was other kids pranking me. One night, I was in a foul mood. I can't remember why exactly, but for the first time I opened the curtains and no one was there. It takes 2 seconds to get to my window from my bed. I was shocked, to say the least. I told my parents, and they told me I was imagining things. Things got worse after that. My sister would wake up screaming that a shadow was after her. My parents passed it off as a normal nightmare. She still has that nightmare to this day. When I was 16, my parents had divorced 3 years before. I was working out in my room lifting barbells at about 8 at night. The tapping on my window had stopped after I opened the curtains when I was 10. It suddenly began again. I opened them, and again there was nothing there. At this time my sister was 11. She still had the nightmares, and she and I had both begun to be scratched. If it was once in a while it'd be nothing, but this was nightly, and we began to get what looked like 2 whole bite marks. The marks were roughly a human canine tooth size. I spoke to the granddaughter of the family we purchased the house from, and they didn't have any paranormal activity while living there. However, she had told me that when her aunt was 16, she had taken her own life in the hall bathroom by drinking a large amount of rat poison mixed with juice. I talked to a friend who was into the paranormal. He told me to get some sage and burn it and get the smoke in every corner of the house. I did this as instructed, and everything stopped for 2 months, but I think I angered the entity because it came back much worse. 2 months after the saging, my sister began seeing the shadow out of her dreams, and so did I. The entity, as best as I can describe, looked like an old cowboy silhouette, cut-out hat and all, but wearing a trench coat, with glowing red eyes. We are still experiencing this creature to this day. I've since married and moved out of the house, but my mother and sister still reside in the home. The Shadow Upstairs by A. Dove. This happened in about 1995. I was 33 at the time. We lived in Tampa, Florida, in an apartment, and my sister and her kids lived in the apartment right across the porch. Her kids ran back and forth between both places most of the time. I would babysit them when she and her husband went out, sometimes even overnight. Once the kids were in bed, I would hear dishes clanking, like someone was putting the dishes away or moving them around. At first I thought my sister and her husband came back early, but once I was downstairs I didn't see anybody. I went to the kitchen and it was completely empty as well. I sat and watched TV and shrugged it off. Later that night at about 11, I was snacking on chips and watching a story on TV. I stopped because I smelled an odour. I sniffed, trying to find out where it was coming from. Upstairs the smell got stronger. I began to panic as I thought something might be on fire, but I still couldn't find anything. Then the odour disappeared. I went back downstairs, but I was nervous and kept sniffing every once in a while to make sure that I couldn't smell it again. About midnight my sister came home. I told her about the noises and the smell. She and her husband looked at each other and said it was nothing. I was quickly shown the door. A few weeks later they asked if I could babysit her kids again. I said yes, not thinking about what happened the previous time. They said they'd be out until about 2 a.m. this time. It was a weekend, so I let the kids stay up a little past their bedtime. At about 10, I put them to bed and settled down on the couch and dozed off. I woke up to the sound of dishes clanking together again in the kitchen. I got up and turned on the lights, but no one was there. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I was unsure what to do. Then I smelled the odour again, but this time I recognised the smell as cigarette smoke. I checked on the kids and they were sleeping. I looked outside thinking someone was smoking on the porch, but again, no one was there. Sitting on the couch, I took a deep breath and tried to make sense out of what I was experiencing. I took a quick glance up the stairs and froze. Standing at the top landing was a shadow of a man. Then the smell hit me, and I could see the tip of the cigarette glow red as he took a puff. Everything was a shadow except for the red tip. He looked in my direction, then disappeared. I quickly checked on the kids and sat waiting for my sister and her husband to come home. I was trembling and kept looking up the stairs, just waiting for him to come back. When they came home, I told them what I saw, and this time I demanded they tell me what was going on. They said it was a ghost. It doesn't hurt anyone, and all I have to do when I hear the dishes or see him is to tell him to stop and leave. I asked him why they didn't tell me that before, and they said they just hoped that I wouldn't notice him. I was mad for a while at them, but 3 months later they moved due to a job closer to where they wanted to live. I would sit on the porch at night and sometimes look up at the window of the house. Every so often, I would see the shadow and his red-tipped cigarette looking back. I moved a year later. Watching Us Sleep by Silence Recited. I moved in with my boyfriend a year and a half ago. We've been together 5 years now and are expecting our first child. He moved into this apartment before I joined him after I relocated from Ohio. I was never really a fan of this place, and he only chose it because during that time in his life he didn't have a car or many options. It was in close proximity to where he was staying at that time in his life, so it was easy for him to move there. The apartment still needs lots of repairs, is tiny and has barely any storage. When he moved in there was still a bed from the previous tenant, as well as medications with Chinese writing and other items in the kitchen cabinets. I'm a very sensitive person in general. Though I've never been plagued by hauntings, I can be extremely emphatic and affected by energies. I have to spend a lot of time alone to recenter myself. When I first moved in here, I was depressed, but I write that off to relocating from a life where I was very independent and lived alone. This was just something to get used to. I felt some bad vibes after a week of living here. After a few days of just being really bummed out, I decided to throw away the remaining items from the previous tenant, and I decided to sage the entire apartment. After that, I kind of settled in. Fast forwarding, the only thing strange that really happened since moving in was I went through this short phase at the end of last year of waking up in the middle of the night, because I've always had trouble sleeping. I would wake up between 12 and 4 a.m. and go to the living room and fall asleep on the couch. One of these nights, I think it was about 3 or 4 a.m., as I was falling asleep on the couch, the room smelled like my grandmother's perfume. My grandmother passed away in 2009. When I think back on it, I think it was around the time my son was conceived, so I feel like that was her checking in, because I'd gotten pregnant. I hadn't had anything happen like that since. This brings us to a few weeks ago. My boyfriend had gone to use the bathroom, and when he came out, he said he was startled because he saw the shadow of a person at the end of the hallway which leads to the living room. This was in the middle of the day, and kind of creeped us both out. A week later, we were in bed. My boyfriend fell asleep before me, and I noticed he was talking in his sleep, which he has done before, but not in quite a long time. I eventually was able to fall asleep, but a couple of hours later I was woken up, suddenly, to the sound of him talking. We were laying down facing each other in the middle of the bed, when I opened my eyes and saw the shadow of a person right behind him. It was just the upper portion of a person. I saw a head, shoulders, chest, arms and hands that were resting on my boyfriend's side. There were no details. It looked like it was looking down on us sleeping. Since I have a hard time sleeping, and I was actually tired that night, I didn't want to acknowledge this thing and make a deal about it because I tend to freak myself out before going to bed when I read ghost stories online. So I asked my boyfriend if he was okay for some reason. I wasn't scared and I didn't feel any bad energy coming from the shadow. My boyfriend mumbled something in his sleep and I laid my head back down and dozed off again. We haven't experienced anything like this before or since, but 2 nights ago when he was working a second job between 10 and 3, I was trying to get some sleep. I was woken up to the feeling of being pushed. I looked at my cat and she was sleeping at my feet, undisturbed. I managed to doze off, but I was woken up again by a much stronger push. After that, I just turned on my phone and waited for my boyfriend to come home. I told him about what happened, and he said that I tend to jerk when I first fall asleep sometimes. I just thought it was weird, because that has never happened to me before. I've never jerked myself awake like that. It felt like someone was shoving me from behind.